I'm actually really excited about this setup. You will see some things today that will blow your mind. That much I can promise. As usual, if you have a question, please post it in the chat. And more specifically, as we do the interaction with Claude later on, if you have anything that you want us to ask Claude, please post that in the chat as well. That said, welcome, Carl, and over to you and Mr. Claude.
Thank you, Fredrik, and thank you for having me on this esteemed series of presentations. It is the first I hope I can qualify for additional events later on. So let's get right to it. A couple of weeks, maybe a few months ago, we started thinking about how we can augment our product offering using large language models. And the timing was pretty good because something called MCP started turning up at Hacker News and other outages that we scour for kind of forward-looking information. And we quickly got to build a couple of things that leverages MCP for interaction with large language models. And that's what we're going to show you here today. So let's start with the kind of architectural basics, the anatomy of an LLM desktop client. And this one actually kind of threw me in the beginning, so I'm going to be a little careful here. I'm going to go a little slow. So in my normal day-to-day operations, when I use Claude Desktop, which is actually one of my favorite LLM clients for interactions with the large language models from Anthropic, I start the Claude Desktop application on my laptop, and that's in contrast with using their web UI. And of course, the Claude Desktop client actually uses REST to talk to the, in this case, or during this presentation, the Sonnet 4 model in the cloud. So this is kind of the basic, the default that everybody's using, at least if you're using a desktop client. And if you go to the next slide, this is what MCP then added to the picture. So still on the left side, Claude Desktop running on my laptop. The majority of the communication is still going over REST to the Sonnet 4 model. But as you can see here, there's a new directional communication coming out of the Claude Desktop client. And it's using MCP, or the Model Context Protocol. And the whole idea of the Model Context Protocol is to allow third-party sources to enrich the conversation you're having with, in this case, Sonnet 4. So it's a very simple protocol. It's actually based on what's called LSP, or the Language Server Protocol, that's used for language-specific extensions to, for example, development environments. And this pretty simple protocol, maybe because it's very simple, took off really, really, really fast. And what that means is that people started building what's called MCP servers. What MCP servers do is a couple of things, but in this context, what our MCP server does, and what I'm going to show you today here, is that it actually provides a bridge from the Claude Desktop client to an instance of our Avassa control tower. And for those of you who has been following Ask the Expert, of course, knows that that's the main, if you like, interaction point with our system, our edge orchestration platform. More specifically, and in this case, we actually talk over standard in and out. So it's a very, very basic protocol between the Claude Desktop client and what's called Avassa Control Tower MCP. So the Claude Desktop interaction, and I'll talk a little bit about that, is over MCP, over standard in and out. And the Control Tower MCP server then, of course, speaks REST to the Control Tower. And the MCP protocol, basically in its most basic form, actually provides the means of doing two things. First of all, on startup, it actually queries the, in this case, our Avassa Control Tower MCP to learn about all the resources available when you start the client. And as it learns about what kind of resources it has or available to it, it can now start calling methods as part of the conversation. So while we're having a conversation mainly with Sonnet 4, if the Claude Desktop client actually recognizes that there are things that can be fulfilled or satisfied by talking to the Control Tower MCP server, and in its case, in its turn, talking to the Control Tower, then it will introduce that as a context to the conversation. Now, there's of course a lot more to say about this, and of course you should go look at the MCP protocol and what people are building with MCP. But this one is really important to understand that the client is running on my laptop. It speaks a local protocol to a server that then speaks REST to an instance of our control tower. So now that you
Can
know,
I just ask really quick?
please do.
There
Please.
are, if I think you told me, but
Yes.
to clarify that, it is possible, right, to run an MCP somewhere else, to host it somewhere else. It doesn't have to run on your laptop.
Absolutely. So
Okay, cool.
yeah, so in this case, we use standard in and out. You can also use HTTP, and that's actually a part of the protocol specification that's kind of rapidly evolving. Most vendors, including ourselves, will eventually launch, let's call it a remote MCP server. So you speak REST over, a network instead of speaking locally to the server. All right, with that, I think I'm going to steal the
please do
the cursor here. Okay. All righty. So here's Claude. Welcome, Claude. This is going to be the interface that I'm going to use. And again, this is not the web UI. This is the desktop client. And Claude has found out, because I've configured it to do so, and we can look at that here, that there's indeed a local MCP server for Avassa Control Tower to be found locally on my laptop. And when I look at it like this, you can see that I've done a little trick here. I've actually disabled all tools. I'm going to eventually enable this, but you can see that all these calls here has been actually found by Claude as it starts up, and it does that resource listing operation as I mentioned before. So when I start, of course, right now with everything disabled, if I ask Claude something like, do you know anything about my Avassa Control Tower? It will obviously say that it doesn't actually know much about it. It will probably suggest some broad understanding of what to do next, but you can clearly see that it doesn't actually know what I'm talking about because it is not allowed to talk to my local MCP server. So, and you can see where this is going. I'm going to actually turn on the MCP integration, enable all tools, and now I'm going to ask it, how about now? Do you know anything about my Avassa Control Tower? And now it actually understands a lot more. It actually is a very eager, it's a very eager friend. So it actually goes ahead and tries to tell me, or actually tells me quite a bit about things that it knows that it can do. And the interesting thing here, because I just now showed you that, of course, there's a list of methods, but I'm just going to show you one more detail that kind of gives you an understanding of how it knows how to interact with the control tower over time. And it will be evident, down the line here during the demo that it knows quite a bit. I'm just going to show you the most basic thing in my terminal here. What I'm using here is a small tool that allows you to actually just run specific calls towards your local MCP server. And in this case, I'm running a method called tools list. And what this does is that it, again, asks the local MCP server just to tell me everything that it knows, what to provide me with or what to do. And it's quite a bit. So I just wanted to show you this. Look, it actually lists all the tools, their names, and maybe more importantly, a description that uses a prompt-like style to describe to Claude, this is what you can expect from this resource, and this is how you should use it, and this is what it is actually in relation to. Because this provides some of the underlying magic you will see later on here when we start interacting with more advanced patterns around our system and how Claude interacts with it.
So when you ask a question, it uses that information to figure out which or I should call these.
Exactly. It
functions,
provides the context for the conversation. So now it has that all in its session memory. So now we can go ahead and do things.
Cool.
So I just also wanted to briefly show you, and of course, if you've been to any Ask the Expert session before, you've seen this. This is my kind of setup for this session. It's got a couple of sites going on here. It's got a couple of applications going on here. Everything seems to be fine. We have an MQTT broker, and I think we have 7 sites. up and running. So this will be the interaction or the instance of a control tower that I will be interacting with. And I'm going to spend most of the rest of the session actually interacting through Claude. So let's get going here. So let's start with something really simple. And I like this because it actually mixes in, let's call it natural language. So I'm going to ask it, which kernel versions do I have in all my sites in all countries known to produce great wine? So obviously a combination of what it knows about my system, but also with what it knows about countries that actually produce great wine. So let's see what it comes up with. So it starts by actually asking about which sites we have, and then actually mixes that with the understanding that out of the countries that we have, France, Italy, Spain, Austria, and Germany actually provides reasonable wine. And it goes ahead and actually collects both of those pieces of information and ensures me that in all wine producing countries, we are running the same kernel version. So it literally then, of course, used the understanding of the system through the get site state call here to enrich the context in the conversation with the Sonnet large language model. Okay, so we know that it can do that. We can then start querying about more detailed aspects of the system. Of course, it has raw access to everything that our APIs, our schema-driven APIs provide. So we can also ask more detailed things like, are we running the same version of container runtime everywhere, and see what it makes of that. The really cool thing here is that our APIs are literally built for and normalized towards, let's call it human interaction, right? So it's a very natural fit with the way something like a Claude thinks and resonates, or reasons at least. So it allows it to do kind of one call ways of resolving what it needs. And in this case, it quickly figures out that yes, we are running everything not really the same exact container runtime. Our edge sites is actually running one version of Docker, and the control tower site is actually running a separate Docker version. And it's figured out that there's literally a difference between our edge sites that is actually the, let's call it the production sites that actually carries the application, and the control tower site that manages our configuration plane. And of course, this is without any training. Of course, for my part, this is a freshly started Claude instance here.
Very cool.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. So, but this is still kind of very static information. So it's a one call reading what things actually, what is the state of things. It can also actually use our APIs to look at things like host metrics. So we can ask him or it in natural language and see how or if we can assemble the host metrics of my site in Paris. Of course, it will figure out that's in France. And you can see here that it's now starting to use reasoning, right? So it actually tries latest system alerts first and figures out that that doesn't actually show disk usage information. It then actually looks through the topics that we have in our telemetry system and figures out that there's something called system site alerts. And then you can get messages by that topic. And that's actually where you find our disk metrics. So you get a very good understanding here of the file systems and the disk space details. And again, it's important to understand that we haven't actually trained Claude on anything here. It actually reasons its way through these calls by using the documentation strings that I showed you before.
And this is actually kind of mind-blowing because this topic, for example, it's not only disk usage, it's like CPU usage, memory usage, network stuff. I mean, this topic is kind of rich, and we log on it every 30 seconds. So there is actually quite a lot of data to pound through.
Yeah, it does that really well. And you know, one side effect might be that we may run out of space for this conversation, but
Sure.
if that happens, I'm going to just restart Claude. Okay, so let's go up the stack. Let's look at applications. You guys know that we're application centric, so of course we want to move towards applications here. So it's going to start reasoning its way to understand what are the applications that are deployed, what are their states, and what is the kind of difference between applications with running state and configuration. And it quickly figures out what I showed you in the web UI. We only have one deployed application. It's the MQTT broker. But we have other applications that are available, meaning they're configured, but they're not actually deployed. And it does a really good job of kind of combing through the application configuration and giving me a decent overview of what all these applications are consisting of, and then a deployment summary telling me that you only have one application up and running here.
So could you ask it at this point what applications we could deploy, and potentially if there are applications we could upgrade?
Good question. Let me try that. I think I got that. What applications do I have available for, let's call it a new deployment or upgrade?
Yeah.
There we go. While it does that, I'm going to do a little thing here in the background. Okay, so now it actually goes through that point of view and says, here are the applications that are available for deployment or upgrade. And of course, it teases out the part that actually you can upgrade an application that you have running, because it understands that, you know, deployed applications have upgrade paths. And of course, applications that are not deployed can, of course, be deployed.
Cool.
So let's do this. I'm going to pick one. I'm going to pick the visitor counter application, and I'm going to see if I can make Claude tell me how it would go about doing that. This is actually one of the parts of Claude that I've struggled with a little bit. It's very eager, so at times it goes ahead and does stuff without, even though I tell it not to. So in this case,
when you say
yeah,
it does stuff,
yeah,
can you elaborate what that actually means?
Yeah, in this case, I'm going to actually allow it, or give it the opportunity to make changes in the system. In this case, I'm going to actually ask it to deploy the application that counts visitors. Please note that I'm not giving it the actual kind of formal name, the name string, but it's, specific enough that it's going to figure out which application I'm talking about. And in this case, I would like for Claude to tell me how it would do that, because I'm asking it to do it, again, to deploy it to countries that make great wine that we discussed before. And I want to see how it goes about doing that. And of course, it's going to use targeted deployments or label matching. And so I want to see how it actually performs. And this is really a multi-step thing, right? So it's making a deployment plan, and it's creating a placement strategy. So learning from the prompts that we have in the documentation, it now tells me that it's actually doing a Boolean OR between label matches for the countries that all these sites are running on, and it actually evaluates the match site labels, making sure that what it believes to be true is actually true. And then it's going to create the application deployment. And it's very, very, now it's actually careful. It didn't do it. So it actually now carefully asked me, after telling me a whole lot of things about where things are going and which requisite checks it's doing. It's now carefully asking me to confirm if I wanted to do that. So again, this is an application that we didn't have up and running. And so now we can ask it to please proceed with the deployment. And then this is actually interesting. So actually, by default, for each operation it does, be that destructive or just reading application, it's going to ask the user, that is me in this case, to confirm that it is allowed to do that. And for all the operations that I've showed this far, I've actually said allow always, but for this particular create application deployment, I'm keeping it to allow once, so I can understand when it's trying to do something that would actually upset the application status of the applications. So I'm going to allow this once, and I'm going to be ready here and ask it.
Do you know, is there a way to kind of put metadata on the functions to say that this is potentially a destructive thing? And
yeah, and the way you do that again is in these kind of almost prompt-like structures,
okay.
where that's where you tell them to be careful. So now it actually knows that it's currently deploying, but that doesn't mean that it's actually up and running. So now I can ask it, how is the deployment going while the container images are being pushed to the sites and we're waiting for things to come up. It's usually a very fast process. So in this case, we're already there. So the status for the entire application or for the entire deployment is now deployed. Took 17 seconds because Claude is keeping track of things like that.
Cool.
And it didn't use anything in terms of rolling cohorts or any other strategies for deployment. So now we're literally up and running, and it gives me a nice little summary of what each site is running in terms of some of them running a combined mosquito and visitor counter, and some of them only running visitor counter.
Really
And
cool.
it's, of course, a little flary. So it now tells me that I can count visitors in all my wine countries, which is great. So now that I have two applications up and running, I can, of course, ask it to do more of an elegant summary of all the applications that we have and where they're deployed. So it will give me that actually based off of, you can see that it actually doesn't do any operations. This is based on a cached understanding of the system status. So it's a really, really fast one. And it gives me, again, a very kind of enthusiastic and very comprehensive view of the system and what I can do now. And it also provides a nice interface into the very kind of operational aspect of this kind of environment. We have significant audit trails. Here we have a lot of ways of querying the system to understand what has happened over time. So what I actually did behind the curtains here was that a couple of minutes ago, I actually killed one of the hosts in the Stockholm site. As you can see here, now one of the hosts are actually down. And now let's see if Claude can actually figure this thing out here. So it's going to summarize the audit trails for Sweden. And it knows that this is actually the topic from our audit trails that it needs. And we shall see. We might have to ask in a different way here. Yes, it says that this looks good. So let me actually rephrase this. I'm going to be more specific. This is also kind of a prompt thing. So I'm going to ask, are there any operational issues with any of the hosts in Sweden?
In its defense, that may not be logged in the audit trail, actually, since it kind of went dead outside.
Cool. So now it's reasoning its way through system alerts and messages by topic and site status and see what it can figure out here. Oh, that's good.
Boom.
Yes. Yeah, so it figured out that, yeah, one of the hosts are down. The other two are actually healthy. And we can see that it actually has seen a couple of issues over the timeline. And this is my current issue. These are actually from our dry runs before. And it knows that this is actually a clustered location. So the Mosquito application that's actually deployed to this site is still running because it's running on a healthy host, but there's a slight service degradation here. So it understands the finer point of the fact that the Stockholm site, again, a cluster, is operational, but it's actually degraded.
Have you
That's really
told Claude anything about clusters and stuff, or does it figure that out by itself from the data?
It literally figures that out itself by understanding the fact that it's a cluster, it's named a cluster, and it gets a lot of state or status from the actual site itself to understand that this is actually a cluster.
Cool.
Okay, so I'm gonna actually see over here. I have a question for you, Fredrik.
Yeah, sure.
Have you been trying to get into my control tower at all over the last couple of hours or so?
No, I have my own control tower.
You have your own control tower. I have a sense that might not be entirely true.
Okay.
So let's see if Claude can figure this out. So I'm going to ask it, Has there been any unauthenticated activities in my control tower recently? This is your last chance.
Darn.
Okay.
Maybe I
Maybe.
tried. I
Okay.
may have
You
tried.
switched to a maybe.
I may have.
Okay.
I may have tried.
So in this case, the hint
Once.
is that it's unauthenticated. So it's going to look for a topic name that matches that, and it's going to get messages by that topic. So it literally
Oops.
actually significant unauthenticated. That's interesting, Fredrik.
Yeah.
Let's see if your
Sorry.
name is in here somewhere. Attacker details. I love that.
Yeah, that's me.
Target username. That is you, right?
I got a little excited. I tested a couple.
And I can see this IP address is kind of resembles the IP span that we have in the office here. So I'd say you're busted.
Yeah, definitely. And again, jokes aside, I mean, these are things that we log, and both in the audit trail and in this particular log, there is a lot of data, and the ability to go over that and put together a report like this is truly amazing.
Yes, it is again pretty interesting what it can do with the contextual understanding of the system and then the large language model.
Yeah.
And again, it's not that we have trained it on the fact that it, for example, understands what different attack vectors are and what a peak attack rate is or anything like that, or the knowledge of a valid username might be a problem here because of you.
Yeah.
So, and the fact that you actually use legitimate tools. And it actually also gives us reasonable immediate actions to perform to actually kind of put a stop to your intrusive attacks on our system here. All right, that actually kind of wraps up what I was going to talk about with Claude. Did we get any questions in the chat that the audience may want us to ask Claude? Otherwise,
just when I see this, what are the biggest hurdles of building something like this for? Well, you built the MCP, right?
Yes.
So
I think what's the hardest, and we kind of avoid that, is that of course there's going to be a translation between what are the resources and methods that's being listed by the MCP server and what it can do in the back end. For us, it's a very straightforward kind of mapping. So if you remember this view here that I showed you, it is a very kind of action or almost like verb-based set of resources.
Yep.
And that maps really nicely to that kind of prompt-like documentation. So we can do things like, actually I can show you some of the code here. If I can just get to it. So we can easily tell Claude that in this case, this is the code for the get sites status. And the interesting thing here is that we can write things like, this is the purpose of this call. And this is the guidance that we give it in order to use this.
Okay.
And so this is how the reasoning comes up. So we can say that, you know, there's only a few known statuses. And we can, in this case, for evaluating match site labels, we can say that the expression must be valid before you proceed.
Yeah.
And for us, that's pretty straightforward because we have an API that's schema driven and that's kind of normalized to how we know people are using our system. That's the underlying, of course, API for our CLI, for our web UI, and for our, well, it's the REST API, and it makes for a very, very nice backend also for a tool like MCP or for any large language model that actually communicates like this. So it's been a very, very straightforward process for us. The only thing that's kind of the task is to think through the purpose and usage guidance kind of documentation. And that's because, of course, some of these things, as I mentioned before, are kind of destructive. You know, it actually does things to running systems. You want to be a little careful with that.
Yeah.
And also kind of nudge Claude along to say, if the user is asking for this, you should probably look at this resource here and things like that, which kind of creates those chains of reasoning that you saw during the demo.
So I actually got a question here if there is a trial version of this.
Yes, good question. There's definitely a trial version of this. So with this Ask the Expert session, this is our kind of, if you like, our kind of small reveal, our dry run of making our MCP server available for a broader audience. And of course, as you well know, we have a free trial version of our system that is eminently well equipped for these kinds of exercises. So please reach out if you're interested, and I'll be more than happy to introduce you to, of course, both our system in general and certainly also our MCP server and how that can be made useful.
Yeah, so we're gonna share we will share the video and the slides after this, and you can find both Carl's and myself's contact information there. So with that, I want to say thank you, Carl, thank you, Claude, and this actually concludes like the spring semester of Ask the Experts, and we will be back after the summer holidays, late August, early September maybe, with new topics. So again, thank you for joining, and thank you for the questions, and thank you, Claude and Carl.
Thank you.